on the phone on her piece in the American Prospect, Monica Potts, titled Post-Ownership Society, How the Sharing Economy Allows Millennials to Cope with Downward Mobility, also makes them poorer. Welcome to the program, Monica.
Thank you for having me.
So, you outline sort of, you write this from your perspective as one of those sort of, millennials or borderline millennials in, I guess, what we call the sort of the creative class, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I'm interested in it because I'm sitting in front of at least two millennials. I'm not sure about the third person. If they are even like a post-millennial, I'm not sure yet, but I think they're a millennial. And it strikes me as that there is, obviously, we hear the statistics, but on a day-to-day basis, it's a very strange era, I think, for people who are sort of dealing with this new economy. There are some ups, and then you talk about it, sort of the things that mitigate, I guess, the lack of opportunity also enhance the lack of opportunity.
That's right. And what I wanted to do with this piece, which, by the way, was in the Washington Monthly.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I apologize.
But, there are all different kinds of, and actually, if you read other pieces in this issue, it explores sort of this era of inequality and the kind of economic troubles that people are going through in many different ways. And, I don't mean to say that people living in the creative class with student loans because they got graduate degrees living in these cities are, the worst off in American society. But I think if we want to think about the era of inequality that we're in a comprehensive way, then we have to sort of consider the fact that everyone almost is doing worse than people in American society who were like them did in previous generations. And so, I'm a journalist. I live in Washington, D.C. I went to private schools and I got a master's degree. And I certainly didn't have to do those things, and no one forced me to take out student loans. But I was making the decisions at the time that seemed best for me and that would be the most fulfilling, and would also think about the way that I wanted to fit into society. And so, I know people older than me, and they all made careers in journalism. They bought homes. They're cruising towards a modest but comfortable retirement. They had children. They sent them to college. They might have had to take on debt to do so at various times in their lives, but overall they were better off because of the investments that they made in themselves, and they made a career doing what they wanted to do. And I think we have to think about whether it's harder for people to do that now and what that means for us. Do we really want a system in which people who want to move to the East Coast or West Coast cities where the creative classes have typically gathered and where a lot of the jobs are, if it's too hard for them, if they have to take on debt to do it, or if they can't afford rent there? I think we have to think about what that means for how these cities will look and how this country will look.
Yeah, I think, and I gotta say, it's sometimes it's hard to write these pieces, I think, for people, because there's a sense of other people will say, well, you're feeling bad for yourself and you've got it great. But the bottom line is that we're doing a disservice if we don't look at what is happening in every sort of strata of our economy or of our social fabric. And I'll tell you what struck me. Because, from my perspective, I feel like growing up, and through my 20s and my 30s, and I had very little sort of, I guess, perspective on all of this because I was in the entertainment business and got very lucky very early. I didn't know anybody who was outside of the entertainment business, which sort of skewed, I think, a lot of my perspective on this stuff. I was lucky enough not to graduate with any college debt. But you make a great point in your piece. In just a generation, college has increased in expense by over 500%. It is stunning. And it's almost as if, your generation was making the same decisions that my generation did, but the landscape had changed dramatically, and there wasn't just an awareness of it. Nobody was aware of it.
That's right. And, with the student loan problem, that's a really big problem. I know people are talking about it a lot in a lot of different ways, but the reality is that I can't think of very many situations in which people can go to college today without taking on any debt at all. Certainly, if I had stayed, I grew up in Arkansas, I was a good student. If I had stayed there, I would have had my tuition paid for me. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't have had other costs associated with being a college student who wasn't able to work, full time, and might have had to take on debt to do that, or get a credit card to buy books, or to be able to finance a car, which I would have had to have if I had gone to the University of Arkansas, for example. And with private schools, when you're a low or very low income student, then, student loans backed by the government are part of your financial aid package. They expect you to borrow the maximum amount that you can every year. So when I was looking at the grants that I got to go to Bryn Mawr, which is where I decided to go, on the same page were the loans I was going to have to borrow to be able to go to school. And certainly if you're middle class or even upper middle class, unless your parents are rich enough to pay your tuition outright, there's a good chance that without a scholarship, you're going to have to borrow for the full freight of tuition of wherever you decide to go. And I think people think, well, has made those decisions. Their parents made those decisions with them. They got a degree out of it. They're going to make more money down the road. I have to say the landscape is much more different and more difficult for kids who don't graduate with a degree because they're not going to get higher earnings down the road. But, the costs that kids are taking on for themselves are dramatically higher than they ever were before. And so they're really taking on a debt that we haven't seen in any other generation. And just because their earning power is going to be higher down the road, that doesn't mean it's not a gamble.
Well, do we have data yet as to how it's impacting people's decisions about where they want to work? Or what they're going to pursue? Because it seems to me it could go one of two ways. One is I'm going to avoid any type of jobs, professions, careers that aren't exclusively about money, or aren't more sort of directed to making money. Or the other way you go is sort of more fatalistic, like I'm always going to be in debt. I'm going to die with this college debt, and so why try and dig out of the hole?
I have to be honest and say I'm not very familiar with a lot of data on this, but anecdotally I can tell you I have friends who went to law school, and when they graduated with that massive amount of debt, they went into positions at private firms so that they could pay off their debt. And these were people who wanted to go into public service law or be a public defender or, work for the government in some capacity. And so, I know that nobody's crying over someone with a law degree who has to take a job at a private firm that pays them more than, 6 figures. But I think that we do have to think about whether that's the most efficient use of our talent, that people are having to sort of pay their dues in a high paying, but what they consider soul sucking career for a little while before they get to do what they want to do. And I think also that we saw in the New York Times op-ed from Lee Siegel a few days ago that he decided not to pay his loans, and I know that was a controversial op-ed. But I do think people are so overwhelmed and buried with debt, they're not paying back their loans in really high numbers. I think about 7 million people default per year. They do it quietly, they do it privately, they're often embarrassed about it. The system is not particularly kind to people who default on their student loans. It's incredibly hard to get them discharged in bankruptcy to the point that it's almost impossible, and your wages and tax returns can be garnished if you default on your student loans. And we really have people paying on insane amounts of debt for 20, 30, 40 years of their lives. That's money that they're not putting elsewhere. It's money that they're not using to build their assets. It's money that they're not using to buy houses or college for their children. And so, whether that's the best way for people to use their money is a question.
Well, let's talk about you talk about this dynamic where there's this supposed sharing economy where you have things like Uber, where you have things like, I don't know, what is it, the one where you get the butler, or things like Etsy, where there are means in which to sort of almost casually dip into these areas to make money, but nobody really makes that much money except for those who organize and basically own these entities. And I don't, you don't come out and say it explicitly, it seems to me, but it's almost sort of like it's letting the air out of the tires just enough to keep things from sort of boiling over. But it's also sort of keeping people stuck in I guess this in sort of a substandard, a new normal.
I think that's right. And I don't. I'm very familiar with these aspects of the sharing economy. I've used Airbnb, I've used Uber, which is a car sharing service. I've used delivery services that deliver foods and goods straight to my house. And I'm on my iPhone all the time. And I know a lot of other people who are as well. And all the people I interviewed for this story were as well. And I think that it does a few things. One is that if you have access to services, then it doesn't feel like you're not making money, right? It doesn't feel like you're poor if you can afford to take a taxi. And the point I wanted to make with these kinds of services, which are usually just apps on your phone, they have very low costs in some kinds of ways. It doesn't take you much effort to call the apps up and to get the service that you want on the other end. You just have to push a button. And also for the people on the other end of it, the people who are driving the Uber car or renting out the room on Airbnb or people who are selling things on Etsy, their effort is also reduced. They just have to push buttons and fill things in on graphs, or if they're an Uber driver and they want to hop onto work, they just push an app and they go pick up fares where they want to and they work as long as they want. And I'm not trying to say that those aren't good things, but I think that what's happened is that we can now as consumers and as providers slice up our work lives in very little bits, and so it feels like a benefit. Or, I can choose the service that I want for just an hour. I can rent a zip car for just an hour, and so it makes it seem like it's an affordable thing that I'm doing. But what we're really doing is that these are actually very traditional services that seem new because of the apps that they use. So, Zipcar and Airbnb and Uber are companies with owners that are getting very, very, very rich off the number of users that they have. And the incentives that they have to keep their companies honest, to keep their services working properly and seeming fair to consumers, and even the pressure that they have to actually make money from what they're doing is kind of reduced because they're probably going to go public at some point soon and get a really big payday because everyone sees these kinds of apps as the future and because they have a lot of users and they collect a lot of data on their users. And so there isn't enough mechanisms, I think, to really think about whether and how these kinds of companies are actually providing a good that is useful for us in the way that we think it is.
So wait, so I mean, this is a broader criticism about the way if this sharing economy is anything other than sort of, I guess, is ephemeral in some ways. You're suggesting that, because a lot of these are sustainable long term.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that they don't do that traditional companies would have done that make the people who work for them better off. And so, I think that we tend to think that these things are great and new and they're so much better than what came before, but I'm not sure that they're actually that much different than what came before. But what the people who created Uber have done, for example, is reduce their own costs because they don't have to provide insurance for their drivers and they don't have to provide equipment for their drivers to use and they don't have to insure their drivers. And so all of the risk is shifted onto the individuals involved, which is a lot like what has happened with student loan debt. We live in a world not just of inequality, but a world in which to a great extent, workers and people and consumers are very much on their own. They have all the risks and they may receive some benefits. But I don't know that we've thought a lot about how much risk people are taking on themselves in investing in their futures and in investing in themselves as workers. And that's a serious shift in the way we've done things from the past.
So so is there, are we just at the stage now where there needs to be sort of a greater awareness of what's happening as we make, because it does really sort of feel like, what we're seeing is both slicing up the consumer experience and the labor experience so thinly that it's hard to see its impact long term, right? As in terms of labor, it's really hard to sort of to suss out exactly what I'm making if I'm doing a certain number of hours this week and then I decide to change it next week. I'm getting paid sort of with my flexibility, which is all well and good at an age and in an era when you want flexibility. But at some point down the road, a significant percentage of people are just going to want to be able to rely on things, and suddenly to start to sort of contemplate like, oh, I'm not just working for me this week, I'm working for my kids 15 years down the road.
Or myself when I retire.
Indeed.
And I think that's right. And I think we do need to have a broader conversation, not just about the things I bring up in the article, but also sort of about what we as a society expect people to have access to, how those things are provided, and the cost to people for the services that they need to live a fulfilling life. I think that if we think about what we want America to look like down the road, if we want it to be educated, if we want to be a country that is educated and that is forward thinking and is still innovative and, bringing new inventions to the world and bringing new medical treatments to the world and all of the things that we think of as being part of a great country, then we have to think about whether the way that we're providing services is going, educational services is going to keep, engendering that kind of advancement. And so if we want the cities on the East and West Coast that are so expensive now to continue to be vibrant, creative class cities, then we have to think about whether the people who we want to live in them can afford to live in them. And these are bigger questions about the way we run our economy and the way we run our political system and the way that we expect individuals to engage with the economy, which is primarily to pay for everything for themselves. We don't like the government to pay for things. We don't like the government to tax people to provide services as a general rule. I mean, some people obviously think we should be doing more of those things. But, Americans have consistently been in the past few decades hostile to those things. And so I think we have to think about whether we're actually providing the services that we as Americans expect to get and expect our children to get.
Do you think that conversation is happening really in any meaningful way?
Almost not at all. I think you see all the potential 2016 and announced 2016 presidential candidates talking about inequality, but it tends to be about people falling out of the middle class and about the 1% gaining so much of the revenues from enhanced productivity. But kind of the bigger questions about the economy and what the government could possibly be doing that it is not doing, I think that as a rule, politicians still see voters as hostile to the idea that maybe the government should be giving them things for free or subsidizing some things more heavily. And so I don't see conversations about fundamentally changing the nature of the economy for the most part.
The irony, to the extent that we're going to hear that, it's going to come from one of the oldest candidates, I would imagine, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders theoretically is going to be talking about that in terms of what kind of role government can play in our society, and
that's right. And
not a millennial.
Yeah, he's not. Although, he's very avowedly to the left, and I think that he's the exceptional candidate in that regard. And whether and how he has some sort of influence or weight on the debate in either party, I think is the question. And I think a lot of people are hoping that he does. And so that remains to be seen. But Hillary Clinton, who's running for the Democratic ticket again, has already sort of started to sound more to the left than she did in 2008. And so maybe there's hope in that regard.
Indeed. Monica Potts writing in the Washington Monthly, folks, the Washington Monthly. And we have a link to it, of course, at majority.fm. The piece is the PostOwnership Society, which, of course, is a play on George Bush's declaring that we were living in the ownership society right before the entire economy tanked. But be that as it may, Monica Potts, thanks so much for coming on today.